Hi everyone, and welcome to today's workshop on avoiding plagiarism. Plagiarism is something that can strike a little bit of worry into some students, but once we have an awareness of what it is, it becomes actually something that's quite easy to avoid. So in today's workshop, we're going to be going through how best to avoid this tricky little subject that is plagiarism. So we'll be covering what is plagiarism, how is it identified by ECD and other universities, what are the consequences of it, and then how to avoid it. So plagiarism, as described by the ECD plagiarism policy, is the inclusion in any form of assessment of material without due acknowledgement of its original source. But in simple terms, that means that plagiarism is presenting someone else's work as your own, or the theft of ideas. So it can appear in many different ways. It could be that you submit somebody else's work with or without their permission. So even if a friend said, oh, I did that module last year, here's my essay, pop it on in there. Or a brother or a sister had written a portion of something on that topic before and you copied and pasted it in, that would be plagiarism. It's also plagiarism if you submit work which has been purchased by any source. So if you've paid a company or another student to write an essay or exam or anything for you, and that would be considered plagiarism. It would be if you're presenting ideas, theories, concepts, methodology, or data from the work of another without due acknowledgement. So we can, of course, reference other people and we can include their ideas or their findings, but we need to do it in an acknowledged way. And last week, our workshop was on referencing, and that is how we acknowledge other people's work fairly when we are writing about their work. And it's a really important part of avoiding plagiarism. So if you haven't seen that workshop, definitely check it out. It can also be plagiarism to present text or images copied with only minor changes without due acknowledgement. So using people's graphs or anything like that, maybe if they had a finding in a research paper, you wouldn't just be able to take any of the images or text out and put it into your own. It's still plagiarism, even if you paraphrase. So even if you don't take the word for word version of what someone else says, if you don't also include acknowledgement. So it's okay to paraphrase once you reference it. It's never okay to just copy and paste work out from another source into your own. So if you don't include the appropriate citations from the original source, that would be plagiarism. Kind of, I suppose, a more unusual one is representing group work as your own. So laying claim to a piece of work completely when it wasn't. It was contributed to by other sources. So that does come up. And then the one I think that trips up so many people is self-plagiarism. So that is where you are plagiarizing yourself. So that could be that you have submitted an assignment that you had submitted previously, part or all of that assignment, either in UCD or another institution. So that would be where, say you did two very similar modules and maybe had two similar questions at different points, and you just were taking chunks of an old essay, even if it wasn't in UCD, into this essay that you're doing now, and that would be self-plagiarism, and it is an offence just like all other parts of plagiarism in university life. So there's often a question then of if common knowledge is included in plagiarism. So if it's a fact that is just widely known and accepted, it doesn't need to be cited or referenced. So the example would be that if Michael D. Higgins is the president of Ireland, that's considered, common knowledge, that it wouldn't be something you need to go look up or read about. It would be something that most people would know off the top of their heads. What does need to be cited is any research by others, any ideas or analysis of primary research, and facts that would not be known if not researched. If you're unsure at all if you should put a citation in, or if you should say that or include a reference in a piece that you're writing, I would recommend that you just cite it and reference it if you're at all in doubt. So we've outlined that there are many different types of plagiarism, the thefts of ideas, or the using basically of materials without referencing. But the question is, can it be accidental? And the honest answer is you don't have to intend to plagiarize. You don't have to know that what you're doing is wrong for it to still be plagiarism. So whether it's intentional or unintentional, it is a serious academic offence, and you may be subject to some disciplinary procedures. Some forms of plagiarism are clearly intentional, like buying or purchasing an essay for submission, and some can be really accidental, things like copying and pasting information into your essay with the intention of cutting it out later, but never really fully paraphrasing it. Or, self-plagiarism can be seen as something quite innocent when and not an intent to actively plagiarize. But really, once you know all the different types of plagiarism, it's much easier to avoid this. So what will happen if plagiarism is detected? So if plagiarism is detected in your work, you'll be invited to meet the school plagiarism committee. And if it's confirmed that plagiarism has occurred, you may be able to resubmit an assignment with a late submission penalty, or your grade will be capped or reduced. There may be capping and reducing of grades without the chance to resubmit. And you may be referred on to the student discipline procedure if that's required. How they decide what action will happen and what severity of ramification you will incur is based on a number of factors, which are all detailed on the policy. But basically, it would take into account like the level of plagiarism. Was it a complete essay or just a few sentences? And things like the number of previous plagiarism offences. So if it's your first time, you might get a slightly more lenient penalty, but if you've had multiple offences, the school and the college would take that quite seriously. So you might be thinking, well, if I can do this accidentally or on purpose, how do they even identify it? So honestly, lecturers and tutors are really good at picking up plagiarism just off the bat when they're reading a piece. It can be really obvious when there's changes in language or style throughout the piece, and you can start to kind of get the element that this is someone else writing and it's not the actual voice of the student. Also, a big tip-off can be changes in font or formatting if the student has copied and pasted in work from multiple sources. Also, the lecturers are really familiar with all of the core texts that you'll be reading, and chances are they've read every reference that you are including in your piece. So they'll be able to kind of identify if that's how it was exactly phrased previously, but also would know if it was your own work or someone else's. And then if that wasn't enough, with the joys of modern technology, there's also plagiarism detection software. And a lot of schools in UCD use this to submit your work through. So it will cross-reference your assignment to published work, but as well other students, your own past assignments and other students' assignments. So if several students were submitting the same piece, it would come up instantly as plagiarism, and it will give you a percentage of the piece that's been plagiarized. So like I said at the beginning, plagiarism can sound scary. It's certainly not something that anyone wants to do. Sometimes students do it both intentionally and unintentionally, but there are lots of ways to avoid it, certainly in that unintentional space. Because ultimately, we want you to take the most out of your classes and engage with the learning outcomes and not be subject to disciplinary proceedings. So how can you avoid plagiarism? The first thing starts when you're actually doing your notes. When you're noting down maybe some readings that you're doing and you're writing down a really interesting point that you would think you would like to include in an essay, or even if you're not thinking about including in an essay, it's really good practice to write down where you got it. So write down the reference with the note in your notepad or on your Word document, whatever it will be, so that when you do include it somewhere, you'll have the reference ready to go for your reference list or bibliography. If you can't remember where you got a piece of information, if it's down in your notes that you did when you were reading, but you didn't write down where that was read or where that came from, it's best to leave it out of your essay at the end. It can be absolutely heartbreaking. It always tends to be the best point that you really want to include, but ultimately it will not improve your grade to such an extent, but the penalty for plagiarism is far greater than not having that piece of work in your essay. Don't copy and paste now would be the big thing. So a lot of unintentional plagiarism happens because of copying and pasting into Word documents. So if you are reading an article and you think that's a really great point, I'm going to copy and paste it and rephrase it. Very often they'll get accidentally left into essays. You'll forget that that's not how that's the original piece, and that's not how you want to say it. And it will come up very quickly, both in the plagiarism detectors, but also by your lecturers reading it. So I would avoid copy and pasting. If you're going to copy and paste it into a separate document, and that's like your notes. Don't copy and paste into the essay itself. Paraphrasing. So as we said earlier, you do, even if you paraphrase something, you still need to reference it. It would be plagiarism to not reference it, but you can't just include pieces with the original wording. You do need to paraphrase. So this is where you express information in your own words and use a citation and reference. So writing in your own words means changing more than just a few words or phrases. So I've given here an example of an abstract from a journal article and my own thesis. So the first is from an article written by Little and Jones, and it says, for masculinity preferences, one sample t-test against no preference. Later on it says, revealed that a woman preferred more masculine male features from short-term relationships when fertile. Masculine faces were preferred, but not significantly so for long-term relationships when fertile. So if I said that as I just did, you would kind of know instantly that's not how I speak regularly. It's not how I write, even in academic writing. So I paraphrased this. It was written in a journal article style, and it was going into my introduction of my thesis. So firstly, I included the citation, Little and Jones, 2012. So that's the first big thing there, is to include my reference. I could also include it at the end, but in this case, I included it at the beginning. So Little and Jones 2012 observed that when judging faces for short-term relationships, there is a preference for masculine faces when fertility is high in the observer, but not when judging faces for long-term relationships. So as you can see, that's much more in my style of speech. even my academic style of speech, it's much more appropriate for an introduction rather than in a journal article. And it's taken the idea, but it's rephrased it, it's put it in a different format. It hasn't just changed one or two words. So that would be an example of paraphrasing. The next thing you can do to avoid plagiarism is to clearly use quotation marks when using quotes. So you can on occasion, this is the one time you can copy and paste something in, would be to use a quotation. That's when you can use the exact words that were used in the original text, but it does need to be marked in quotation marks. So if you are doing that, say you wanted to include a quote from the novel you were discussing or whatever it might be, you must clearly mark that quote in quotation marks, and you should still include a citation or reference. I think I could say every one of these slides with, and you should still include a citation or reference. It's absolutely key to avoiding plagiarism. So the next thing is that referencing, is including the reference or the citation. And it does take practice to reference. It's something you will develop over the whole of your degree. So not to be too worried about that. And it's the kind of thing that you need all the different referencing guides open at the beginning, and then you start to get in the swing of it. We're really lucky that there are so many technologies now that allow you to reference seamlessly as you go, but I feel that referencing is something that it's good to get kind of an under the bonnet look at, so that even if the technology is doing most of the heavy lifting, you'd be able to spot if there was a mistake. So firstly, last week we did a referencing workshop. So if you want to go back, it's up on Brightspace and up on our website. But generally, I would say to check out the library guides. And there's a link on my slides, which will be available on Brightspace after this. And check out the guides, and see you can have a look at specific types of referencing for the style that you're doing. So your school might say that they want you to do Oxford, Chicago, Harvard, whatever it might be referencing. Sometimes you have a choice, so you can choose your favorite, but all of the major referencing styles are covered in the library guides, and they're some of the best ones available, and I'd really recommend them. So what they look like is a couple of images on the screen, and they're a little bit small, but I'll describe them. So these are what the guides look like inside. So they give all these different examples of different situations and how you reference that. So for instance, how you reference when there's one author, when there's two, when there's an editor, when it's something from a website, when it's something from Twitter, and how you reference that. It goes through pretty much everything from articles, books, online, and there are different ways for each of those things. So it's really important that you take a look and make sure you're familiar with that and have those guides handy when you're writing. So that was absolutely a whistle-stop tour of how to avoid plagiarism. Today's a very short workshop. So if anyone has any questions, I'm absolutely happy to answer them. I'm going to stop the recording now. So goodbye to everyone on the recording, and then I'll happy to take any questions.